Mark Chen stared at his phone's weather app with an intensity usually reserved for stock market crashes or breaking news. The temperature reading of -15 degrees Fahrenheit, -26 degrees Celsius, wasn't a warning to him. It was an invitation. 6 months of diving into cold exposure research, countless scientific papers, and hours of Wim Hof documentaries had led to this moment. He couldn't help but smile at the delicious irony. While his neighbors cranked up their thermostats and huddled under electric blankets, he was about to willingly step into nature's freezer. Through his living room window, the pristine Minnesota winter landscape stretched out before him. Fresh snow blanketed his backyard, untouched except for the trails left by ambitious squirrels and cautious rabbits. The setting sun painted the sky in strokes of deep purple and burning orange, a beautiful backdrop for what his neighbors would soon consider a public display of insanity. As Mark began removing his sweater, he caught sight of the Thompson kids next door pressing their faces against their playroom window, their warm breath fogging up the glass. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief as he continued stripping down to his shorts. 8-year-old Tommy, the eldest, ran away from the window, presumably to alert his parents about the neighbor who had finally lost his mind. The preparation for this moment had been methodical, almost obsessive. Mark's coffee table was covered with printouts of scientific studies on cold adaptation, highlighted passages about brown fat activation, and dog-eared pages describing the cardiovascular benefits of cold exposure. His laptop displayed an email from his friend Dr. Sarah Williams, a sports medicine specialist who had reluctantly given him safety guidelines while questioning his sanity. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his sister Alina. "Please tell me you're not really doing this today." Mark chuckled as he typed back, "The colder, the better. Don't worry, I've got this." He could almost hear her exasperated sigh from 3 states away. The neighborhood of Pine Lake Falls had always been a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. As Mark stood in his living room, now wearing only his black compression shorts and a thin moisture-wicking shirt, he could see the ripple effect of his impending workout spreading through the houses around him. Mrs. Davidson paused her evening dog walk to stare openly at his house. Mr. Rodriguez, who was shoveling his driveway, stopped mid-scoop, his mouth slightly agape. Mark took a deep breath, implementing the specialized breathing techniques he'd practiced for months. His chest expanded fully as he focused on the diaphragmatic breathing that would soon become crucial for maintaining his core temperature. The mirror reflected back an image of a man who looked simultaneously terrified and thrilled, his angular features set with determination, dark eyes bright with anticipation, and his athletic frame already showing goosebumps from the draft sneaking under his door. A final check of his preparation list. Emergency thermal blanket hidden under the back porch, a concession to Dr. Williams' safety demands, phone fully charged to track his session, and a thermos of hot ginger tea waiting for his return. He'd even set up a small camera to document his first cold exposure workout, though he wasn't sure if he'd ever have the courage to share the footage. The collective gasp from his neighbors was almost audible as Mark finally opened his front door. The brutal cold hit him like a physical wall, immediately raising every hair on his body. But instead of retreating, he squared his shoulders and stepped out into the winter air. His bare feet met the snow-dusted path to his backyard, and he couldn't help but let out a small yelp that he hoped none of the neighbors heard. "Mind over matter," he whispered to himself, his words visible in the frigid air. As he walked purposefully toward his designated workout spot, he realized there was no turning back now. The neighborhood of Pine Lake Falls was about to witness either the beginning of an inspiring fitness journey or the world's most elaborate way to earn a Darwin Award. As darkness descended over Pine Lake Falls, Mark Chen's methodical setup took on an almost ceremonial quality. The motion sensor lights in his backyard flickered to life, casting long shadows across the pristine snow as he arranged his equipment with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. His breath materialized in ethereal clouds, dancing upward into the darkening sky before dissipating into the biting Minnesota air. The black yoga mat he carefully unrolled immediately protested against its new frozen home, its normally supple surface becoming rigid within seconds of touching the snow. Mark watched, fascinated, as tiny ice crystals formed along its edges. Nature's way of reminding him just how extreme his chosen endeavor was. The resistance bands, usually bouncy and responsive, had already lost their elasticity in the cold, feeling more like stiff rubber hoses than exercise equipment. His phone, serving as both timer and emergency lifeline, struggled against the elements. The screen barely responded to his increasingly numb fingers, and the battery percentage seemed to drop by the minute, demonstrating technology's vulnerability to extreme cold. Mark made a mental note to keep his emergency phone in his jacket pocket by the back door, assuming he could still think clearly enough to remember it later. The theatrical lighting created by his motion sensors drew an audience. The Thompsons' curtains were now fully open, with both parents joining their children at the window. Mark could see Mrs. Thompson reaching for her phone, likely adding to the growing neighborhood group chat that had been buzzing with speculation about his sanity. Across the street, Mr. Peterson had abandoned his evening newspaper routine entirely, choosing instead to witness what he probably assumed would be tomorrow's headline. Local man freezes solid in bizarre exercise attempt. At minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, even the simple act of breathing required conscious effort. Each inhale felt like swallowing ice shards, while exhales created such dense vapor clouds that Mark occasionally lost sight of his own feet. He began his pre-workout mobility routine, moving through fluid patterns that looked more like a winter warrior's war dance than traditional stretching. The snow crunched beneath his feet in an odd rhythm, providing an eerie soundtrack to his preparations. His carefully researched breathing techniques were already being put to the test. The Wim Hof method, which had seemed so straightforward in his warm living room, took on new complexity in the brutal cold. Mark forced himself to maintain the pattern: deep inhale, short hold, controlled exhale. Each breath cycle became a small victory against his body's growing urge to panic and flee back into the warmth. The resistance bands, when he finally picked them up, felt like frozen serpents in his hands. Their usually smooth surface had developed a strange, almost brittle texture. As he attached them to his designated anchor point, a sturdy oak tree that had witnessed generations of less extreme backyard activities, he could hear them creaking in protest. The sound eerily mimicked the concerns voiced by his sister Elena during their heated phone debate earlier that day. Mark's skin had already undergone a remarkable transformation. What started as pale flesh had quickly become mottled with patches of angry red as his body fought to maintain circulation. The thin moisture-wicking shirt, designed for professional athletes, seemed laughably inadequate against the Minnesota winter. It clung to his torso like a sheet of ice, already gathering frost along the seams. Through the growing darkness and his own vapor clouds, Mark caught glimpses of phones lighting up in neighboring windows. His impromptu performance was apparently worthy of documentation. He couldn't blame them. The scene probably did look surreal. A half-dressed man methodically preparing for a workout in weather that had sent even the neighborhood's most sturdy outdoor cats scrambling for shelter. As he finished his setup, positioning his emergency supplies within reach but out of the snow, Mark realized the true challenge wasn't just the cold. It was maintaining focus while feeling like a performer in an absurd Arctic circus. With one final check of his rapidly freezing phone timer, he squared his shoulders and faced his designated workout space. The real test was about to begin, and his audience, whether he wanted one or not, was settling in for the show. Mrs. Patterson's casserole dish wobbled precariously in her trembling hands as she watched the scene unfolding in her neighbor's backyard. Through the steamy window of her warm kitchen, she witnessed what could only be described as a man deliberately choosing to become a human icicle. The 68-year-old widow had lived through 43 Minnesota winters on Maple Street, but nothing had prepared her for this particular brand of madness. Her famous tuna casserole, usually the center of her attention at this hour, lay forgotten on the counter as she pressed closer to the window. Mark Chen, whom she had always considered one of the more sensible neighbors despite his peculiar health food habits, was performing what appeared to be a deranged interpretation of a snow angel, though he was very much vertical and alarmingly conscious of his actions. "Good Lord in heaven," she muttered, adjusting her reading glasses for a better view. The motion sensor lights illuminated Mark's routine like some bizarre outdoor theater production. What he would later explain as a dynamic warm-up looked more like a man simultaneously fighting off hypothermia and invisible bees. His arms windmilled through the frigid air, creating small vortexes of disturbed snowflakes that sparkled in the artificial light. The steam from her cooking fogged up the window, and Mrs. Patterson found herself wiping it away with increasing frequency, unwilling to miss a moment of this unprecedented neighborhood entertainment. Her landline phone sat within arm's reach. She'd already placed it there after the first glimpse of Mark's unusual evening activities. The yellow pages lay open to emergency services, though she wasn't quite sure which department handled cases of voluntary freezing. From her vantage point, she could see other neighbors equally transfixed by the spectacle. The Hendersons across the street had abandoned their usual evening routine of watching Wheel of Fortune to cluster at their living room window. Even Mr. Henderson, who typically needed his walker to move around, stood unaided, pressed against the glass like a child at a candy store. Mark's breath had created a personal microclimate around him, a cloud of vapor that occasionally obscured him from view entirely. When visibility cleared, Mrs. Patterson could see him moving through a series of increasingly concerning exercises. He dropped into push-ups directly in the snow, his form perfect despite the absurdity of the situation. The thin layer of frost forming on his moisture-wicking shirt sparkled under the motion lights, making him look like some sort of winter fitness fairy. Her casserole continued to cool on the counter, but Mrs. Patterson couldn't tear herself away from the window. She watched as Mark transitioned into what appeared to be jumping jacks, each landing creating a small explosion of powder snow around his bare feet. Bare feet, she exclaimed to her empty kitchen, her voice carrying the same tone she used when discovering mold on her prized sourdough starter. The digital thermometer mounted outside her kitchen window blinked mockingly, -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Mrs. Patterson had lived long enough to know that these temperatures weren't meant for human exposure, let alone whatever fitness routine Mark was attempting. She'd seen feral cats with more sense than to stay out in this weather, and they wore fur coats year-round. Her fingers inched closer to the phone as she watched Mark's skin transition through various concerning shades of red and white. The conservation instincts ingrained from decades of Minnesota living screamed at her to intervene. In her mind, she was already composing the conversation with emergency services. Yes, operator, my neighbor is attempting to become the world's first living popsicle. No, he doesn't appear to be under the influence, unless you count whatever fitness guru has convinced him this is a good idea. As Mark continued his routine, now incorporating what looked like martial arts moves into his regimen, Mrs. Patterson's internal struggle intensified. The practical Midwesterner in her argued that grown men should be allowed to make their own mistakes, while her maternal instincts demanded immediate intervention. Her finger hovered over the phone's keypad, each digit of 9 to 11 becoming more tempting with every passing minute. Through her fog-free patch of window, she watched as the winter darkness deepened and Mark Chen's private Arctic workout showed no signs of ending. Something had to be done, she decided. After all, she hadn't spent 4 decades in this neighborhood to watch a perfectly good neighbor turn himself into a garden statue during the first real cold snap of the year. The transformation of Mark Chen's body in the brutal Minnesota cold was nothing short of remarkable. His skin, which had started the evening with its natural olive tone, now displayed a canvas of physiological rebellion. The color progressed from ghostly white to alarming shades of red, creating patterns that would make abstract artists envious. In the harsh glare of the motion sensor lights, he looked like a bizarre human mood ring responding to the extreme temperature. Each burpee became an exercise in defiance against both gravity and survival instinct. Snow flew up around him in small explosions as he dropped into push-up position, his arms trembling not just from exertion, but from his body's desperate attempt to generate heat. The tremors that had started as a mild annoyance had evolved into what felt like an internal earthquake, his muscles vibrating at a frequency that seemed to blur his vision. The strange part, the part that both thrilled and terrified him, was the warmth beginning to spread through his core. Mark had read about this phenomenon in his research, but experiencing it was entirely different. It felt like someone had lit a small furnace inside his chest, even as his extremities screamed in protest. The scientific papers had called this brown fat activation, but to Mark, it felt more like his body had decided to forge its own small sun for survival. His carefully planned circuit continued. Burpees transitioned to mountain climbers, then to squat jumps. Each movement sent shockwaves of sensation through his body, a bizarre mixture of numbness and hypersensitivity. The snow beneath his feet no longer felt cold. Instead, it registered as a series of sharp pinpricks, like stepping on thousands of tiny needles. His brain, struggling to process these unusual signals, began producing sensations that seemed to defy physics. His skin felt simultaneously on fire and frozen. The vapor from his breath had created a personal atmosphere around him, a cloud that followed his movements like a loyal ghost. Through this self-made fog, he caught glimpses of his neighbors' concerned faces pressed against their windows. The Thompsons had apparently called reinforcements. Their window now displayed 3 additional faces he didn't recognize, all wearing expressions that ranged from horror to morbid fascination. Mark's muscles, pushed to their limits by the combination of exercise and extreme cold, began performing their own choreography. Random twitches and spasms rippled across his body, creating movements he hadn't planned. His right calf suddenly seized in a cramp that felt like it might snap his leg in half. The pain was electric, shooting up his leg with an intensity that momentarily cleared the fog in his mind. The most unsettling development was the way his thoughts began to drift and fragment. The cold had created a strange disconnection between his mind and body. While one part of his brain methodically counted reps and monitored his form, another part floated away, contemplating the abstract beauty of ice crystals forming on his eyelashes. He found himself giggling at the absurdity of it all, the sound carrying across the silent winter landscape in a way that probably didn't reassure his worried observers. His phone, propped against his water bottle, which had already frozen solid, displayed 18 minutes into his planned 40-minute workout. The screen looked distorted through his frozen eyelashes, the numbers seeming to dance and blur. Mark blinked hard, sending tiny ice showers from his lashes, and forced himself to focus. The research papers hadn't mentioned how the cold would affect vision, but the world had taken on a dreamlike quality, edges softening, and colors intensifying. The tremors that racked his body had developed a rhythm of their own, like some primitive Morse code tapping out a message of survival. His teeth chattered with such force that he worried about dental damage, but the sound had become oddly comforting, a percussion accompaniment to his bizarre winter workout. The thin, moisture-wicking shirt, now more ice than fabric, crackled with every movement, creating a crystalline symphony that echoed in the still night air. As Mark pushed through another set of burpees, he realized he had crossed some invisible threshold. The cold was no longer an external force to be endured. It had become a part of him, integrated into every cell and fiber of his being. Whether this was adaptation or the beginning of hypothermia, he wasn't entirely sure, but the distinction seemed increasingly irrelevant as he continued his frozen dance under the watchful eyes of his stunned neighbors. Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, usually a haven of warmth and comfort, had transformed into an emergency command center. Her pot roast, a recipe perfected over 30 years, sat neglected on her Danish modern table while she paced between the window and her landline phone, her floral house slippers wearing a visible path in the linoleum. Each pass by the window revealed Mark Chen's continuing descent into what she could only describe as winter madness. "I simply cannot stand by and watch this foolishness any longer," she declared to her empty kitchen, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years as a high school English teacher. The thermometer outside her window now mockingly displayed -16 degrees Fahrenheit, having dropped another degree since this spectacle began. Her cat, Mr. Whiskers, watched from his heated bed with typical feline disdain as she finally reached for the phone. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the receiver with practiced professionalism. 911, what's your emergency? Mrs. Patterson took a deep breath, suddenly aware of how bizarre her report would sound. "Yes, hello," she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if Mark might hear her through 2 sets of walls. and 40 feet of frozen air. There's a man in my neighbor's yard. She paused, watching as Mark performed what appeared to be a jumping jack sequence that would impress an Olympic athlete, if not for the fact that he was clearly losing his battle with hypothermia. Is he attempting to break in? The dispatcher prompted, typing sounds evident in the background. Oh no, dear. Worse. Mrs. Patterson pressed closer to her window, forcing herself to document every concerning detail. He's exercising. In shorts. In -16-degree weather. I believe he's lost his mind, and soon he'll lose his fingers too. Her voice rose an octave as Mark dropped into another set of what she could only describe as snow push-ups. The dispatcher's attempt to maintain professional composure was evident in their voice. Ma'am, is this person showing any signs of distress? Mrs. Patterson snorted, a sound she normally considered unladylike. Signs of distress? His skin is the color of my prize-winning roses, and he's creating more steam than my tea kettle. Between anxious bites of her now-cold pot roast, she continued her increasingly colorful description of Mark's death-defying snow dance. He's out there performing some sort of Arctic aerobics routine, she elaborated, warming to her subject. I've seen polar bears with more sense, and you know what else? She didn't wait for a response. He's smiling, in weather that would freeze a smile right off your face. The dispatcher's typing had slowed, suggesting either rapt attention or stunned disbelief. Ma'am, has anyone approached him to check on his welfare? Approach him? Mrs. Patterson's voice dripped with Minnesota nice sarcasm. Dear, the last person who opened their door took one step outside and immediately declared it colder than a witch's kiss. Nobody's going out there except this winter workout warrior. Through her window, she watched as Mark transitioned into what appeared to be yoga poses, his breath creating a personal fog bank that occasionally obscured him completely from view. The motion sensor lights cast dramatic shadows across the snow, making the scene look like some avant-garde outdoor theater production. I've lived in Minnesota for 43 years, she continued, building to her crescendo. I've seen people ice fish in business suits, teenagers wearing shorts in April, and my late husband Harold once tried to grill in a blizzard. But this is beyond the pale. The dispatcher assured her they would send officers to check on the situation, but Mrs. Patterson barely heard the response. Mark had just completed what looked like a handstand in the snow, and she nearly dropped her phone in shock. Send someone with experience in cold weather rescues, she advised, her teacher's authority returning, and maybe a psychologist, and some hot cocoa, the good kind, with mini marshmallows. She paused, watching Mark execute another perfect burpee. Actually, better make it hot toddy strength. We're clearly dealing with a situation that requires more than marshmallows. As she hung up the phone, Mrs. Patterson returned to her observation post, armed with her pot roast and a deep conviction that she had just saved a life, even if the life in question seemed surprisingly enthusiastic about risking it. The next morning's scene could have been plucked straight from a sitcom's most absurd episode. Officers Rodriguez and Chen, no relation, stood in Mark's warm living room, their winter uniforms suddenly feeling oppressively hot as they watched him casually sip green tea and conduct a Zoom meeting. The contrast between their expectation of finding a hypothermic victim and the reality of a perfectly healthy man typing on his laptop was causing visible cognitive dissonance. So, Mr. Chen, Officer Rodriguez began, shifting uncomfortably in his heavy boots that were now creating small puddles on Mark's hardwood floor. We received a rather concerning call last night about someone potentially suffering from exposure in your yard. He glanced at his notepad, though the details of Mrs. Patterson's colorful report were seared into his memory. Mark held up one finger politely as he finished his Zoom conversation. Thanks, everyone. We'll reconvene tomorrow, he said to his laptop before closing it. The steam from his tea curled up lazily in the warm air as he turned his full attention to the officers. Ah, yes. I imagine Mrs. Patterson wasn't too thrilled with my workout routine. Officer Chen's eyebrows shot up. Workout routine, sir, the caller described, and I quote, a man performing death-defying snow acrobatics while turning the color of a summer tomato. He paused, taking in Mark's healthy appearance and the array of scientific papers spread across his coffee table. The room temperature was a cozy 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and Mark sat there in a comfortable sweater and joggers, looking more like a tech executive working from home than someone who had recently attempted to become a human popsicle. A wall-mounted TV behind him silently played a documentary about ice swimming, adding an almost comical backdrop to the conversation. "I can explain everything," Mark said, reaching for a thick folder labeled Cold Exposure Research. "You see, I've been studying the physiological benefits of controlled cold exposure for months." He pulled out several peer-reviewed papers, spreading them on the coffee table like a professor preparing for a lecture. Officer Rodriguez, despite his professional attempt to maintain a serious expression, found himself leaning forward with interest. The scientific papers, complete with highlighting and careful annotations, spoke of improved immunity, enhanced mental resilience, and increased metabolic efficiency. His partner, Officer Chen, had already pulled out his phone and was quietly taking notes. "Last night was my first practical application of the theory," Mark continued, pulling up his workout log on his tablet. "I monitored my heart rate, breathing patterns, and even recorded my skin temperature changes throughout the session." The meticulous data collection impressed both officers, though they tried to maintain their professional demeanor. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. "While this is fascinating, Mr. Chen, you understand why your neighbor was concerned. The temperature was well below zero." He paused, then added with a hint of curiosity, "How did you not freeze?" Mark's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "That's the most interesting part." He launched into an explanation of brown fat activation and the body's adaptive responses to cold stress, complete with diagrams he printed from medical journals. The officers found themselves unconsciously nodding along, their initial skepticism melting faster than spring snow. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Patterson pretending to water her indoor plants while clearly straining to see into Mark's living room. The morning sun highlighted the patch of compressed snow in Mark's backyard, where he performed his controversial workout, the area now looking more like the site of an unusual snow angel convention than a potential crime scene. "So you're telling me?" Officer Chen summarized, his notepad now filled with bullet points about cold adaptation, "that you were perfectly safe the entire time." He glanced at his partner, who was already downloading a Wim Hof breathing app on his phone. Mark nodded, taking another sip of his tea. "Absolutely, though I appreciate Mrs. Patterson's concern. Maybe I should bring her some of this green tea and explain the science behind it all." He smiled, noticing both officers' continued glances at his research materials. As they prepared to leave, Officer Rodriguez paused at the door. "Just one more question, Mr. Chen," he said, trying to sound official while his partner continued to scroll through cold therapy websites. "This brown fat activation thing, does it really help with metabolism?" Mark's enthusiastic explanation of cold exposure benefits had transformed his living room into an impromptu seminar hall. Officer Rodriguez, now perched on the edge of the sofa, was furiously typing notes into his phone, while Officer Chen had abandoned all pretense of official business and was deep into a YouTube rabbit hole of cold therapy testimonials. "So you're telling me," Officer Rodriguez interjected, pausing his note-taking, "that this crazy-looking workout actually triggers your body to create its own internal heating system?" His free hand unconsciously touched his midsection, where his winter uniform concealed what he considered an unfortunate accumulation of desk-duty donuts. Mark pulled up a detailed graph on his tablet, his eyes sparkling with the enthusiasm of someone finally finding an audience for their passion. "Exactly. See these temperature readings?" He pointed to a series of colorful lines that tracked his body's response throughout the previous night's session. "This spike here shows when my brown fat activated. It's like flipping a metabolic switch." Officer Chen, who had been quietly comparing cold exposure apps on his phone, looked up. "But what about the hypothermia risk? Mrs. Patterson was convinced you were turning into a human icicle." He couldn't help but glance out the window, where their patrol car was still visible and Mrs. Patterson was now very obviously watching them through her curtains while pretending to dust the same spot for the 5th time. "That's where the preparation comes in," Mark explained, pulling out his meticulously detailed training log. The pages were filled with carefully recorded data, temperature readings, exposure times, recovery metrics, and even weather conditions. I spent months building up to this. Started with cold showers, then progressed to longer exposures. Last night wasn't just some random decision. It was the culmination of careful planning. Officer Rodriguez had by now subscribed to 3 different cold therapy YouTube channels and was comparing prices on ice baths. His partner noticed and suppressed a smile, remembering their conversation just yesterday about needing to find a new fitness routine. The breathing technique is crucial, Mark continued, demonstrating the pattern he used. His chest expanded fully as he walked them through the method, and both officers found themselves unconsciously mimicking the movement. It's not just about enduring the cold. It's about teaching your body to adapt and thrive in it. The scientific papers spread across the coffee table had grown into an impressive display as Mark pulled out more research to support each point. Studies from prestigious universities, medical journals, and sports science institutes created a compelling narrative that made his crazy workout seem increasingly logical. What really fascinates me, Mark said, pulling up a particularly detailed study on his laptop, is how this practice affects mental resilience. The officers leaned in closer as he scrolled through data showing improved stress responses, enhanced focus, and increased emotional regulation in cold exposure practitioners. Officer Chen, who had initially been the more skeptical of the two, was now taking detailed notes on proper cold exposure progression. "So you're saying we shouldn't just jump into a frozen lake tomorrow?" he asked, only half joking. Mark laughed, remembering his own early enthusiasm. "Definitely not. That's how you end up giving Mrs. Patterson a real reason to call 911. He started outlining a beginner's protocol on a fresh page of Officer Chen's notepad, complete with safety guidelines and progressive steps. The conversation had evolved far beyond their official visit, with topics ranging from the evolutionary basis for cold adaptation to modern applications in sports medicine. Officer Rodriguez's phone was now filled with bookmarked articles and saved videos, while Officer Chen had somehow ended up enrolling in an online course about breathing techniques. As they reluctantly prepared to return to their patrol, both officers found themselves viewing their thick winter uniforms differently, not just as protection from the cold, but as a barrier to potential physiological benefits. Mark had managed to transform their wellness check into a masterclass on human adaptation and resilience. Just remember, Mark called after them as they headed toward their car. "Start with cold showers." He watched through his window as they drove away, noting with amusement that Mrs. Patterson had progressed from dusting to reorganizing her entire windowsill, all while maintaining perfect surveillance position. Within weeks, the legend of Pine Lake Falls' frozen fitness guy had spread through the community like wildfire, transforming from a tale of apparent madness to one of begrudging admiration. Mrs. Patterson, in perhaps the most unexpected plot twist, had evolved from concerned neighbor to Mark's unofficial public relations manager, complete with a detailed schedule of his workouts posted on her refrigerator. Her kitchen, once a solitary domain of casserole preparation, had become the unofficial viewing gallery for Mark's winter workouts. Every evening at 7 p.m. sharp, a select group of neighbors would gather around her bay window, clutching steaming mugs of her signature hot cocoa, now dubbed frozen fitness fuel, while watching Mark's routine with a mixture of awe and secondhand shivers. "He's not crazy, you know," Mrs. Patterson would inform any newcomers to her viewing parties, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had made a complete ideological transformation. "It's all very scientific. Did you know the Vikings used to do something similar?" She'd then launch into a surprisingly detailed explanation of cold adaptation, peppered with terms she picked up from her numerous conversations with Mark over their weekly Sunday tea sessions. The neighborhood had developed its own unique relationship with Mark's unusual hobby. The Thompson kids had started timing their homework breaks to coincide with his workouts, pressing their faces against their playroom window and keeping a running tally of his exercises. Their father had even caught them attempting to recreate Mark's routine in their backyard, thankfully while fully clothed in winter gear. Officer Rodriguez had become a regular visitor to Pine Lake Falls, his patrol route mysteriously aligned with Mark's workout schedule. He could often be seen parked discreetly at the end of the street, taking notes and occasionally attempting modified breathing exercises in his squad car. His partner, Officer Chen, had started a cold exposure and law enforcement blog that was gaining surprising traction in the department. The local newspaper, the Pine Lake Chronicle, ran a feature story titled Cold Comfort: The Man Who Befriended Winter, complete with photos of Mark performing his now famous routine. The article had to be reprinted 3 times to meet demand, with copies finding their way into break rooms and coffee shops across the county. Even the weather itself seemed to have developed a respect for Mark's dedication. On particularly brutal Minnesota evenings, when the temperature plummeted to depths that sent even the hardiest locals running for cover, Mark would emerge like some winter spirit, his breath creating spectacular vapor clouds that danced in the motion sensor lights. Mrs. Patterson's viewing parties had evolved into impromptu community gatherings. Her famous tuna casserole had been joined by contributions from other neighbors: Karen's spicy chili, Bob's homemade bread, and Tom's legendary hot toddies. The group had even developed a sort of bingo game based on Mark's routine, with squares for a complete snow angel burpee. And Mrs. Thompson gasped audibly. The most surprising development came when spring began to hint at its arrival. Instead of the expected relief at the end of Mark's winter workouts, there was an almost palpable disappointment among the neighbors. His evening performances had become such an integral part of community life that their potential end created a noticeable void. But Mark had one final surprise for his loyal audience. On the last truly cold evening of winter, he emerged from his house carrying a stack of laminated cards. He distributed them throughout the neighborhood, each containing detailed instructions for beginning a cold exposure practice, complete with safety guidelines and progressive steps. He titled them Pine Lake Falls Cold Adaptation Protocol, because sometimes crazy is just early. Mrs. Patterson received a special version, decorated with small snowflakes and bearing a personal note of thanks for her transformation from concerned neighbor to dedicated supporter. She displayed it prominently on her refrigerator, right next to her hot cocoa recipe, now modified to include recovery-enhancing spices. As winter reluctantly released its grip on Pine Lake Falls, the legend of the frozen fitness guy had become permanently woven into the community's fabric. Mark had not only proven his sanity, but had managed to transform a neighborhood of skeptics into enthusiastic supporters of his crazy idea. Though some still preferred to watch from behind Mrs. Patterson's warm windows, they all had to admit, sometimes the craziest-looking decisions lead to the most remarkable transformations.